Okay,
Are you going
that.
back to the beginning?
What do you mean?
Are we recording over what we just
No,
did?
there's no recording over. It's not tape.
Okay.
So, so it is December 27th, 2013. And I just want to hear any story you'd like to tell. I have some stories that I would like to hear about, or hear again. But, so we can start with either one you want to tell or one I want to ask you about.
I'd rather start with something that you want to know about.
Okay. So, I have seen a video in which you and some other men of legal background were talking about about starting some sort of legal aid office in the '60s here in Memphis. But I just want you, if you could tell me a little bit about what that was and how it came together and what you did while you were there and the years that it was going on.
Well, there had been a national movement prior to the middle 1960s. I'm not sure how early it began, but there had been a national movement for upgrading the kind of representation that people who didn't have much means could afford by virtue of some sort of public supplement. The federal government, particularly under President Lyndon Johnson, had been very anxious to get money into the system for this purpose. It was accepted in some parts of the country, but in Memphis and the South in general, it was resisted, not because people didn't want other people to have representation, although there may have been some motivation about that, particularly racially based, but more importantly, at least for that period and understanding history at that period, because we were at the end of the Cold War, and anything that involved injection of public monies into what had previously been a private system was viewed by an awful lot of people with suspicion, because it smacked to them of an awful word for that time, socialism or communism. And so when people had tried in the initial stages that I knew about when I became a lawyer in 1964 and 65 to utilize or try to apply for that money, they were met with all kinds of speeches by what was really a small minority, but a loud minority, saying that this shouldn't be done because, first, there was enough private representation on a pro bono basis to meet any need, and secondly, because use of public monies was socialism. It got defeated a couple of times at our local bar association level, and then, as is shown in that video that you were referring to, the death of Dr. Martin Luther King spurred an awful lot of people to go farther than they had gone before in trying to achieve the end of having representation for the poor, which, at least in the southern United States, translates into representation for what we now refer to as African American people. There was a local effort that had been ongoing, but we got traction because one fellow, whose name was Mike Cody, who was a lawyer, friend of mine, we were all friends of each other, socially or professionally, and originally there were 12, and it grew to 20, and we got some private money that I think Mike provided, but maybe it was his senior partner, Lucius Birch, a couple of $1,000 to pay for a secretary. The secretary kept track of the cases that we took, and we were out in the black community in a church that Reverend Jim Lawson provided for us on Mississippi Boulevard. And this was all right after Dr. King was killed in April of 1968. And the effort really took on some traction about June is when we got our office, and we would meet people out there at night, and if they qualified for free legal aid, we would give it to them. We'd just take it back to the office and handle it. If it was a fee-producing case, then we would send it to just any number of other lawyers who would be glad to take a fee-producing case. But these were cases that generally wouldn't generate a fee, and not out of the proceeds of the case, and that lawyers would take on a pro bono basis. And from that, we demonstrated that there was a need not only in the black community, but in the white community also. And once we demonstrated it, the effort on the part of those who were against it was pretty much diluted, and application was made for the federal money, and the Johnson administration was more than happy to give it to us, and now there has been for many years a thriving and active and very effective legal aid service here in Shelby County.
So what was that called? When you formed that office, did it have a name or did it have an acronym or something like that?
Not that I recall. There may have been, but I don't recall it. It was just us.
I see. Did it become something when it became more people started?
Ultimately, when the federal money came, there was an organization that became what is now Legal Services. It's called Legal Services.
Okay. All right. And so what did you as an individual do in this office? And was this in
we would
1968?
We would arrive at night, usually 2 or 3 of us at a time.
Mm-hmm.
There'd be a line of people outside. They'd come in one by one. They'd sit down with maybe 2 or 3 of us and explain their situation, what they thought their need was, what their problem was. We would initially decide whether it was a case that the office could take, that it was not a fee-producing case. Then we would just dole it out among one of the 3 of us in the example I'm giving. Say, well, all right, I'll take that case. And then you just take the case back to your office, tell the people to meet you there the next day or the day after that or whenever you could fill them into your calendar. And you would render the same sort of legal services you would render if they came in off the street and were a fee-producing client.
So why was it important to have an office in this church rather than simply put out to people that you could come into your law firm or your office and talk about that? Why did you need to have it in the community? Is there a barrier that was...
Well, you have to remember that after Dr. King's assassination, there was a curfew in Memphis. And people could not be out on the streets, particularly black people. It was supposed to be everybody, but the fact of the matter was you could come and go as you wanted to in the white community. This was the segregated South. And when black people were moving around at night during this curfew situation, the police were suspicious. So we had to have a place in their community where they could feel relatively safe. It had to be a readily identifiable place. The church itself, which was on Mississippi Boulevard, was reasonably well known in the black community, and Reverend Lawson, who had been for many years fighting the good fight, was very well known in the black community. The interesting thing was, and this was brought out at least in that program that you referred to earlier, is that when we got there in the initial stages, we were very surprised to see that not only were there black people lined up around the block, there were plenty of white people in that line too, maybe not a majority. But if those white people were willing to go into the black community during the curfew, when the police were out there with their billy clubs, and when there were some black militants also active on the streets, they really wanted a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And that defeated the initial argument, which was, oh, well, there's no need out there. There was this crying need. We didn't really have to try real hard to prove our case. It was just aching to be proved.
And were these just run-of-the-mill civil and criminal needs for lawyers, or was there something specific?
As I recall, these were not criminal cases. Okay. I mean, they might have had some criminal overtones in the sense that some law might have been broken, but they were more of a civil nature. people who were being evicted from their household because some landlord may or may not have been proceeding according to the rules, as an example. Somebody who perhaps was being accused of creating a nuisance in his or her community, and they felt that what they were doing was something they were legally entitled to do. But they didn't have the sort of training to present their case before a judge themselves in order to show that the law had not been breached, that sort of thing.
Okay. So, and how long did you work there? How many
The
years?
pilot program, I mean, when you say how long did I work there, maybe I went out there 4 separate times over a year's period of time, and each time maybe picked up a client or two. That would be the maximum number. The pilot program lasted a year or two, as I recall, and as soon as we had some impressive statistics, it wasn't necessary to have it anymore. Now, the cases we took varied in length, and they might have gone on for years or might have been over in a month's time. It just depended on the case.
Okay. So who were the people who worked in that office with you?
Of the ones that I remember were Charlie Crump, who was the senior partner of Apperson, Crump and Dusain, Mike Cody, Charlie Newman from the Birch Porter firm, and there may have been others from the Birch firm, I just don't remember them offhand. Jim Allison, Irvin Bogotten, Rowlett Scott, who was in the same firm as I, Percy Magnus. There were many other, Ron Barad. There were others, they're just not coming to mind right now.
Okay. All right.